Hello. I'm going to talk about two words today, natural and unnatural. Now, when I was a sixth former, one of my teachers would constantly tell to me, if you want to have a debate or a discussion about anything, really you need to define your terms, first of all. So that's what I'm going to do. And the observant amongst you will have noticed that, like a lot of Zoom chatters, I have a little bookcase here of books in the background, and I'm going to take one of those books down. It's a dictionary. Used to be the natural place to look up words before the internet, and I'm going to look up those two words to get some meaning and some definition before we start. So let's look up natural. Existing in or caused by nature, not artificial or caused by mankind. A natural landscape, for example. Then there's unnatural. Against nature, abnormal, not existing in nature, artificial. I've often been involved in debates where these two words have been freely thrown around, and often in quite an accusatory manner. People will say things like, oh yeah, of course that's right, because that's the natural way of doing things. Or, yeah, but you've got to admit that that's unnatural, isn't it? So what my talk is going to be about today is about the fact that the use of these words in debate is often quite divisive. And instead of encouraging debate, it actually stifles it by excluding some people from the discussion because the way of life that they lead, or the ideas that they have, or the things that they consume are considered to be unnatural. These two things are often played off against each other. Yeah, we often see in images the natural as opposed to the unnatural. We look at our planet and we say there are some parts of it that are natural and there are some parts of it that are unnatural. We often put technology and innovation in our modern day world as an unnatural place, whereas the countryside and nature as the truly desirable place. And what I'm going to argue is that once again, this excludes some people from the debate. Those people who cherish a certain lifestyle can easily be labelled as unnatural. So we very much live in a world where anything to do with nature is seen as akin or equal to goodness. We talk about eating natural foods, leading a natural life, getting perhaps closer to our ancestors from the past, natural childbirth, a natural life in the country, getting close to nature. These are all things that they've almost got a pure or an idyllic or sort of almost a mythical feel to them. Whereas on the other hand, if we label something as unnatural, we're often talking about things like processed foods or an unnatural way of life, living in a city, the rat race, unnatural pressures on us in our lives. There are some people out there who talk about unnatural relationships when they're talking about same-sex relationships. And so we have this sort of playoff in debate sometimes between people who see things as natural and see things as unnatural. But actually, for a start, there are lots of things within nature that are not good for us anyway. There are earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, tsunami, and attacks from COVID-19 viruses. These are all naturally occurring events, but no one, I don't think, would argue that they are good for us. So my argument here is that this idea of things of being natural and unnatural is actually a fallacy. Everything is natural. We should rid ourselves of the use of the word unnatural. Everything comes from nature. Everything we produce, our own human intelligence that has enabled us to shape and make and construct and manufacture things from nature, that also is natural. So let's take that smartphone that you're probably still holding while you're listening to this talk. That too comes from nature. It's built by human intelligence using hundreds of different chemicals, compounds, metals, plastics, all created from nature. And so it could be argued that that is a natural product that you hold in your hands. When we talk about something like pollution, for example, lots of environmentalists don't use the word unnatural because it's not a good description of what's happening. A better way of saying is that oil in a river, polluted air, these are simply things in the wrong place rather than being unnatural. In particular, I feel that the use of the terms natural and unnatural can be quite detrimental, and that is they're used by people who think the only natural relationships are those between a man and a woman. Those who, because of religious perhaps or moral reasons, often wish to label same-sex relationships or homosexual relationships as unnatural. Despite the fact that we know history tells us, nature tells us, that homosexuality and same-sex relationships are found throughout history, throughout nature, and that the fact that somebody does desire to be in a same-sex relationship is a natural thing. It's not an unnatural way of living. It comes from us, from nature. We are products of nature, and so anything we do is a natural thing. People have moral and religious views, and my human rights background tells me that people should be able to have those views, even if I dislike those views. But at the same time, to label the way of life that somebody leads as an unnatural way means that children brought up in those environments or people who are living in same-sex relationships will often feel excluded from debates if the lives that they lead and the things that they do are constantly labelled as unnatural. And for some reason, this reminds me of a Christmas present I got a few years ago. It was one of those desktop calendars. I'm sure some of you may have had them as presents, where each day was a page that had a word on it that you could learn and potentially use. I think I've forgotten most of them by now, but I digress. So I'd like to end by giving you a recommendation to unlearn a word. Unnatural. It's a divisive, useless word that means nothing in our modern world where we know that everything comes from nature. It would be better if we define things in terms of being natural but being good or bad for us, or good for society or bad for society. Let's take one final example. Alcohol, a naturally occurring thing in nature, something that we have created as well, and which used excessively can be bad for us, but is still a natural product, whichever way we look at it. And those people who are keen to still continue to use the word unnatural, they need to be reminded of things in history that were labelled potentially as unnatural, whether that was votes for women, unnatural, IVF, test tube babies, unnatural, organ transplants, unnatural, contact sports for women, unnatural. Many US states, right up until the 1970s, still had laws that forbid interracial relationships because they were considered unnatural. So it's time to drop that word and think of things in terms of everything being natural, but some things being good for us as a society and some things not. So I hope I've given you some food for thought, both natural and unnatural.